The cup was still warm in Eliza Townsend's hands when Elijah Finley turned around. She had not asked permission. She had not announced herself. She had simply walked through the door of the foreman's shack at the edge of the Oregon timber camp, set the tin cup of strong black tea on the corner of his scarred wooden desk, and stood back with her arms folded across her chest as if she had done it 1,000 times before. Every man in Camp Harlow knew that nobody walked through that door without being summoned. Not the timber boss, not the company man who rode up from Portland once a month with the payroll. Not the Pinkerton detective who had come last spring looking for a man with a scar behind his ear and left 3 days later without asking a single question twice. Nobody. Elijah Finley had been foreman of Camp Harlow for 4 years. In those 4 years, he had shut down 3 organized brawls with nothing but his voice and his stillness. He had fired 6 men on the spot for stealing from the company store, and not one of them had argued with him past the first word. He had walked out onto a log jam on the Umpqua River alone in February water and freed it with a pike pole while 40 men watched from the bank, certain they were watching a man die. He had not died. He had walked back to the bank, pulled on his boots, and gone back to work without a word about it. He was 6 feet and 3 inches of contained, deliberate force, and the way he moved through the camp unhurried, measuring, absolute, had settled into the bones of every man on the payroll as a simple fact. You did not test Elijah Finley. And yet here was this woman, standing in his shack, and the tea was already on his desk. He turned from the wall where he had been marking the week's board footage with a grease pencil, and he looked at the cup, and then he looked at her. His eyes were the dark gray-green of river water in November, and they did not warm up the way most men's eyes did when they found a woman standing in front of them. Eliza Townsend looked straight back. She was 30 years old, lean and straight-backed, with dark auburn hair that she wore in a practical braid and hands that were not soft. Her eyes were the color of strong tea, which he thought was an irony she probably did not intend but might have, because he was already beginning to suspect that very little Eliza Townsend did was unintentional. "You are the new scaler," he said. It was not a question. It was a test. "I am," she said. "Eliza Townsend. I arrived yesterday evening on the freight wagon from Roseburg. I start tomorrow morning, but I came tonight because I wanted to introduce myself before the work starts, and because the cook at the meal tent had black tea, and I thought you looked like a man who had not eaten since midday and would not eat again until morning." The silence that followed was the kind of silence that men at Camp Harlow associated with something about to happen. "How did you know I had not eaten?" he said. "Because the cook told me you sent your supper plate back untouched, and because the burn mark on your left thumb is fresh and the coffee can near the stove in this shack is empty, which means you made yourself coffee instead of eating and burned yourself rushing it, and that was hours ago." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at his thumb. Then he looked back at her. Something shifted in his chest that he had not felt move in a very long time, and it alarmed him considerably more than any log jam on the Umpqua had ever done. "Drink the tea," she said pleasantly, "and you are welcome." She turned and walked out the door. He stood in his shack for a full 30 seconds after she left, the grease pencil still in his hand, looking at the cup of tea on his desk. Then he sat down slowly in his chair, picked up the cup, and drank it in silence. He was already in trouble, and he knew it. But the story of how they had arrived at that moment, a feared man sitting alone in a timber camp shack, undone by a cup of tea, had begun weeks before, in a way that neither of them had planned and both of them later would agree had been entirely inevitable. Eliza Townsend had been born in 1858 in the mill town of Coos Bay, Oregon, to a timber surveyor father and a schoolteacher mother, which meant she had grown up with one parent who taught her to read everything and another who taught her to read the land. Her father, James Townsend, had started taking her into the timber with him when she was 7 years old, not because he lacked for a son, he had two, but because Eliza had simply followed him one morning without asking and had kept up, and after that he had seen no reason to send her back. By the time she was 12, she could identify a stand of Douglas fir by the bark alone and estimate its board footage within 5% without using a rule. By the time she was 18, she had learned to use a Scribner scale stick and log rule properly, understood the mathematics behind every conversion table in the industry, and could scale a load of logs faster and more accurately than any man her father employed. This was not a small thing. Scaling, the process of measuring cut logs and calculating their board footage, which determined how much the company paid the loggers and how much the mill paid the company, was the most consequential single job at any timber operation. A bad scaler could bankrupt a crew. A dishonest scaler could steal from either side of the transaction and be nearly impossible to catch unless someone else knew exactly what they were doing. A great scaler was worth 3 of any other worker on the payroll, and everyone in the timber business knew it. Eliza was a great scaler. She had spent the decade after her father's death in 1880 working timber operations up and down the Umpqua and Cockwell River drainages, hired quietly by mill owners who had learned through reputation that she was accurate and uncheatable and would not be intimidated. She had been underpaid nearly everywhere she went because she was a woman, and she had argued about it at nearly every camp and won at most of them, because the alternative was losing the most accurate scale record in southwestern Oregon. She had never married, not because she lacked for offers, but because most of the men who offered seemed to expect that she would stop working, and she had no intention of doing that. When she had received the letter from the Pacific Lumber Company offering her a scaling contract at Camp Harlow, at a rate 3 cents per 1,000 board feet above what she had been making at her last posting, she had written back accepting within the hour. She had also written a brief, firm, additional paragraph noting that she expected full access to all loading decks, accurate daily crew reports, and a private sleeping space that did not require her to share a bunkhouse with 40 men, as this was a matter of practical comfort and not timidity. The company had agreed to all 3 conditions. What the company had not told her in their letter was that the previous scaler at Camp Harlow had been fired 2 months prior for falsifying records, that the resulting audit had left the camp's finances in a state of forensic chaos, and that they needed someone capable not only of scaling going forward, but of working backwards through 6 months of fraudulent records and determining exactly how much had been stolen and from whom. She had found all of that out when she arrived. She had also found out about Elijah Finley. Every worker she encountered in her first 12 hours at Camp Harlow had found a way to mention him. Not boastfully, the way men sometimes talked about a boss they admired. Not fearfully exactly either, more the way you mentioned a mountain range when describing the terrain as a feature of the landscape that shaped everything around it and could not be ignored. Finley runs a tight camp, the freight wagon driver had told her as they came down the last grade into the valley. He does not put up with nonsense. Men who cause trouble do not stay long. Men who work hard do not go hungry. It is a fair operation. And what does he think about having a woman scaler? She had asked. The driver had been quiet for a moment. I do not know that he has been asked yet. She had thought about that. Then she had said, well, he will have an opinion tomorrow morning one way or another. In fact, Elijah Finley had been told. The company letter informing him of the new hire had arrived 2 weeks before Eliza did, and he had read it 3 times and then set it on his desk and gone about his work without mentioning it to anyone, which was itself a form of endorsement, or at least of non-objection, that the more senior men in camp understood and the newer ones did not. What nobody knew, because Elijah did not talk about his personal life as a matter of principle, was that he had not been surprised by the idea of a woman scaler. He had known women who worked timber. His mother had kept her husband's scale books for 15 years after his father's hands had been destroyed in a mill accident, and she had done it with such precision that the company had never suspected they were dealing with anyone other than the man whose name was on the contract. Elijah had grown up understanding that competence had nothing to do with gender and everything to do with the person holding the scale stick. What had surprised him was the name, Eliza Townsend. He had heard that name. Every serious timberman in the Umpqua drainage had heard that name, attached to accounts of a scale record so clean and accurate that one mill owner had allegedly had it independently verified 3 times before he believed it was not too good to be true. So when the new scaler had walked into his shack that first evening and set tea on his desk without being asked, his silence had not been dismissal. It had been something much more complicated. It had been a man who had spent 4 years building walls realizing, with sudden and inconvenient clarity, that someone had just walked through them without noticing they were there. The next morning, Eliza was at the loading deck at first light. Camp Harlow sat in a wide valley at the western edge of the Cascade foothills, south of Roseburg, in the fall of 1888. The timber was old-growth Douglas fir, some of the best in Oregon, enormous straight-grain trees that the logging crews had been working their way through for 3 years. The felled logs were brought down the slopes on a skid road, a long track of small peeled logs laid crosswise in the mud to reduce friction, and dragged by teams of oxen to the loading deck near the river, where they were scaled, loaded onto rafts, and floated downstream to the mill. The loading deck on October morning in the Oregon foothills was cold, loud, and dangerous. The logs came down the skid road at speed, guided by the skill of the bull punchers driving the ox teams, and the landing on the deck was controlled chaos. Enormous timber hitting timber, the ox teams working, the choker setters and rigging men shouting back and forth in a language of signals that looked like confusion from the outside, and was precise engineering from the inside. Eliza walked onto the deck with her scale stick under her arm and her tally book in her coat pocket, and went straight to work. There were looks. There were always looks, and she had long since learned to distinguish between the kind that would become a problem and the kind that would settle into grudging acceptance within a week. Most of the men at the deck were in the second category. She could see it in the way they watched her, curious, uncertain, but not hostile. The timber business, whatever its other faults, tended to sort people by their usefulness pretty efficiently once you gave it time. She was 3 logs into her first tally when she heard the boots. Elijah Finley walked onto the loading deck the same way he walked everywhere, unhurried, straight, with the particular quality of attention that made a large man seem larger than his actual size. He stopped a few feet away from her and watched her work in silence. She was measuring a log with her scale stick, noting the small end diameter, then pacing the length and marking her book, then moving to the next. Her movements were economical and exact. She did not look at him. "You start at the small end," he said after a minute, "not the large. The Scribner rule measures board feet from the small end diameter," she said, without looking up. "If you start from the large end, you overestimate the yield and you are paying the crew for timber that does not exist. The previous scaler started from the large end. That is part of why your books are a disaster." Another silence. "You looked at the books already," he said. "I looked at the books last night after I came back from your shack. I had 4 hours. I have found preliminary evidence of systematic overscaling of approximately 18 to 20% across the last 6 months of records. I will need another 2 or 3 weeks to establish the precise figures." He was quiet for a long moment. The sounds of the deck went on around them, the crack of timber, the oxen, the shouted directions of the rigging crew. "That is a significant number," he said. "It is. It represents a substantial theft from the company and possibly from the logging crews, depending on how their contract bonuses were calculated." She finally looked at him. "I will need the original contract sheets for the cutting crews as well as the company tally books. Do you have them?" "Yes." "Good. I will need them this afternoon." He looked at her, she looked at him. The morning light was coming over the ridge in long, cold angles, and somewhere up the skid road an ox team was beginning its descent with the first load of the day. "The crew will want to know who you are," he said. "Then introduce me," she said simply, "and let me get back to work." He introduced her at the noon meal, standing at the head of the long plank tables in the meal tent with 40 men around him, and Eliza standing beside him with her arms folded and her expression entirely calm. He said her name and her position, and 3 sentences about accuracy and fair dealing that were really a message to the crew about what he expected from all of them going forward. And then he sat down, and she sat down, and that was that. Or almost that. A man named Cutler, big, slow-spoken, 3 years at the camp, said from the far end of the table that he did not see why they needed a woman doing a man's job, and said it just loudly enough to land in the silence that followed Elijah's introduction. Elijah did not respond immediately. He poured his coffee. He set down the pot. He looked at Cutler with the expression that men at Camp Harlow associated with the moment just before something decisive happened. "Cutler," he said, "how accurate was your scale record last month?" Cutler blinked. "What? Your individual haul, how close was it to the company average?" I don't know. About average, I guess." "It was 4% below average," Elijah said. "Which means either you are not working as hard as the crew around you, or the loads you have been assigned have been consistently underscaled, and you have been underpaid. Miss Townsend is going to find out which. If it is the second one, you will owe her an apology and a thank you. If it is the first one, you and I will have a different conversation." He picked up his fork. "Either way, she is your scaler and you will treat her accordingly." Cutler did not say another word. Eliza kept her face neutral, but something had moved in her chest at the plain, direct manner of it. He had not defended her exactly. He had simply explained why her competence was in his and Cutler's own interest, and then he had moved on. It was the most useful kind of endorsement she had ever received, and it had come from a man she had met less than 24 hours earlier. That afternoon, Elijah brought her the contract sheets. He came to the small office space the company had arranged for her, a corner of the supply building, partitioned off with rough-cut boards, just enough room for a desk and a stool and a shelf, and he set down a wooden crate full of ledger books and paper-clipped contracts without a word. She looked at the crate. She looked at him. "There is a cup of coffee on the ledge outside the door," he said. "The cook makes it worse than I do, but better than nothing." He left. She sat for a moment, looking at the door he had just walked through. Then she allowed herself a small, private smile that she would not have allowed herself in front of anyone at all. She got to work. The next 2 weeks settled into a rhythm that neither of them discussed, but both of them understood. Eliza scaled the deck every morning, worked the audit books every afternoon, and ate her meals at the far end of the plank table where she could watch the whole tent and think. Elijah ran the camp, managed the cutting crews, handled the supply chains and the mill contracts and the daily machinery of an operation that fed 43 men, and produced an average of 80,000 board feet of timber per day. They talked about work. They talked about it at the loading deck in the mornings when she had questions about haul assignments. They talked about it in the afternoon over the audit materials, which increasingly pointed toward a fraud scheme more sophisticated than she had initially estimated. They talked about it, occasionally, in the evenings when she happened to be walking past his shack, and the light was still on, and the door was open. And those conversations, which started about timber and contract law and the liability exposure for the Pacific Lumber Company, had a way of sliding sideways into other things. Into the way the Douglas fir smelled in the rain that came in the second week of October and lasted 3 days, and turned the camp roads to deep mud that the oxen sank into past their hocks. Into the books they had each read, which turned out to be a surprisingly overlapping list. Elijah had a crate of books under his bunk that included a worn copy of Thoreau, 2 volumes of Washington Irving, and a mathematics text he had been working through on his own since the previous spring. Into the question of why she had come to timber work in the first place, which she answered with the story of her father, and into why he had come to camp management, which he answered more briefly, that he had needed work that was real and consequential, and that the woods had seemed honest to him in a way that other things had not. She asked him what the other things were, and he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I will tell you that story another time," and she understood that there was a dark past in it somewhere and chose not to push. He asked her once, it was a Thursday evening, rain still coming down outside, the lamp making a warm circle in the shack, whether she ever intended to stop. "Stop what?" she asked. "This work, the camps, the moving from place to place." She considered the question genuinely. "I have not thought about stopping," she said. "I have thought about staying somewhere long enough to build something. There is a difference." He looked at her in the particular way he had been looking at her lately, attentive, careful, as if she were a text he was reading slowly and did not want to misunderstand. "Yes," he said, "there is." They stayed on opposite sides of the room for the rest of that conversation, but the room felt smaller than it had before. It was in the third week of October that Eliza found the second layer of the fraud. She had been working backward through the tally books, cross-referencing the scale records with the mill receipts and the crew contracts, and she had established the basic overscaling scheme. The previous scaler, a man named Aldrich Wells, had been inflating the log measurements, which meant the company had been paying crews for more timber than they actually cut, and the excess payments had been going into a side account that Wells controlled. It was a clean, clever theft that had been running for 8 months before a mill auditor in Portland had noticed a discrepancy in the board footage ratios. What Eliza found in the third week was that Wells had not been working alone. There was a secondary set of figures. She found them buried in the freight manifests rather than the scale books, which was why the initial audit had missed them. That showed a pattern of load weights that did not correspond to the recorded footage. Somebody had been pulling timber off the loads between the scaling deck and the river and diverting it. The missing timber was not enormous in volume, but at old-growth Douglas fir prices in 1888, it amounted to a significant sum. More importantly, the freight manifests were signed by a river driver named Tanner Walsh, who was still employed at Camp Harlow. She sat with this information for a full day before she decided what to do with it. The problem was not reporting it. She intended to report it. The problem was how. Walsh was a large, volatile man who had been at the camp for 2 years and had a circle of 3 or 4 friends on the river crew who followed his lead. If she went to the company directly and Walsh found out before the company acted, she was in a vulnerable position in a remote timber camp with no law enforcement within 40 miles. She could go to Elijah. She turned this option over carefully because she was not in the habit of taking things to other people. She had handled every difficult situation in her working life, and there had been many by herself and by her own resources. But she was also honest enough with herself to know the difference between capable independence and foolish stubbornness, and this was a situation that had genuine physical risk attached to it if she misjudged. She went to Elijah. She found him at the oxen yard in the late afternoon, talking to the head teamster about a lame animal, and she waited until he was done, and then she said, quietly, "I need to speak with you privately." He looked at her face and apparently saw enough there to say to the teamster, "We will finish this tomorrow," and then walked with her to the shack without a word. She laid the freight manifests out on his desk and walked him through the figures. He did not interrupt her. He stood with his arms folded across his chest, looking at the papers as she spoke, and when she finished he was quiet for a long moment. "You are certain," he said. "It was not a doubt. It was a question about the standard of evidence. The figures are clear. The pattern is consistent over 5 months. Tanner Walsh signed every relevant manifest. I cannot prove personal knowledge or intent from the documents alone, but the financial discrepancy is unambiguous." He nodded slowly. "How many people have you told?" "Only you." He looked at her then. The full, direct look that she had come to understand meant he was assessing something seriously. "You could have sent this straight to Portland." "I could have. And then the company would have sent an agent, and Walsh would have had several days' warning while the agent traveled, and Walsh has friends in this camp who are bigger than I am." You thought about your own safety, he said, as if this impressed him. I thought about the practical realities of the situation, she said, which included my own safety, yes. Something in his expression shifted, not dramatically, not in any way that a stranger would have read, but she had been watching his face closely enough for 3 weeks now that she caught it. It was something like relief, she thought, as if he had been waiting for her to acknowledge that she was not invulnerable and had been afraid she would not. I will handle Walsh, he said. I know you will. I also want to be present when you do. I'm the one who found the evidence and I want to stand behind it. He thought about this for a moment. Tomorrow morning, first thing before the crews go out, I want him off balance. Agreed. She gathered her papers. She was at the door when he said her name, not Miss Townsend, her name. The first time he had used it, she stopped. You were right to come to me, he said, not because you needed help, but because it was the sensible thing and you were sensible enough to do it. She turned and looked at him across the room and the lamplight and 3 weeks of careful, deliberate, mutually observed restraint. Thank you, Elijah, she said. She walked out into the night, and the cold air hit her face, and she thought about the way he had said her name and did not stop walking until she was safely inside her own partitioned space in the supply building with the door closed behind her. Then she sat down on the edge of her cot and pressed her fingers to her mouth and permitted herself, briefly and privately, to feel the entire weight of what was happening to her. She was falling in love with the most feared man in Camp Harlow. She was falling in love with the most careful, self-contained, quietly powerful man she had ever met, and he had just said her name in a way that meant he was fighting exactly the same thing on his side of it. And neither of them was going to do anything foolish about it, she thought, until Walsh was dealt with and the audit was complete, and she was no longer employed by the same company that employed him, because she was not going to compromise either of their professional positions for the sake of her feelings, and she was fairly certain he was operating from the same principle. But she was certain about the feeling itself. She blew out her lamp and lay down in the dark and listened to the rain that had started again, and thought about Douglas fir in the lamplight and a worn copy of Thoreau under a bunk. The confrontation with Tanner Walsh went differently than either of them had planned. They found him at the river landing at 6 in the morning, in the gray pre-dawn cold, alone except for one of his crew who had come down early to check the raft bindings. Elijah had told Eliza to stand back and let him lead, and she had agreed, because she understood the practical dynamics of the situation. But she stood close enough to hear and to be seen, which was its own kind of statement. Walsh was a big man, mid-40s, with the weathered face and the thick forearms of a man who had worked rivers for 20 years. He heard Elijah out in silence, arms at his sides, and when Elijah stopped talking, Walsh looked at the papers Elijah was holding and then looked at Eliza. She found this, Walsh said. It was not a question. She did, Elijah said. Walsh looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not quite read, not rage exactly, more like a cold calculation, and then he said, "Those figures are wrong." "They are not wrong," Eliza said, before Elijah could respond. The discrepancy in load weight at River Station C versus the scaling deck records for the same loads is consistent and reproducible from the documents. If you want to dispute them, I can walk you through the arithmetic yourself. "I don't need a woman to walk me through anything," Walsh said. "Then perhaps you can explain to me how the aggregate board footage recorded at the deck is consistently higher than the aggregate weight of those same loads at the river, given that the density of Douglas fir at this moisture content is a well-established number." She held his gaze steadily. "Because I have done that calculation 7 times and it comes out the same every time." Walsh stared at her. For a moment nobody moved. Then Walsh made a decision that was clearly a bad one even as he was making it. Eliza could see it in his face, the shift from cold calculation to desperation, and he took one step toward her. He did not take a second step. Elijah moved between them without haste, without drama, simply placing himself in Walsh's path in the unhurried way he did everything, and stood there looking at Walsh with those dark gray-green eyes. "No," Elijah said. "Just the word." Just the voice. Walsh stood very still. The river moved behind him. His crew hand had not moved at all. "You will go to your bunk," Elijah said. "You will pack your personal belongings. I will send a rider to Roseburg today, and you will be detained here until the company's legal representative arrives. If you attempt to leave the camp or to interfere with Miss Townsend's work in any way, you will answer to me personally and then to the Roseburg sheriff. Do you understand me?" A long moment. Walsh's fists were closed. "Yes," he said finally. "Good. Murphy, this to the crew hand, you will stay with him until I send somebody to relieve you." He turned from Walsh entirely, which was itself a statement about the threat level he was assigning to the situation, and looked at Eliza. His face was composed, but she could see, this close, that his jaw was set in a particular way. He had been genuinely prepared to use force. He had not wanted to. He had hoped the weight of his presence would be enough, and it had been, but it had been close. "Come away from the river," he said quietly. She walked with him back up the bank toward the camp, and when they were far enough away from the landing that they could not be heard, she said, "Thank you." "You would have stood your ground," he said. It was not quite a statement and not quite a question. "I was not planning to move," she agreed. He stopped walking and turned to look at her. The morning light was just beginning to come properly over the eastern ridge, cold and clear, and the timber stood black against it. "Eliza," he said, and there was something different in the way he said it now, something that had moved past the professional acknowledgement of the night before. "I know," she said softly, "but not yet." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once slowly, and they walked back to camp. The company representative arrived from Portland 9 days later, a sharp-faced man named Cortland who wore a good suit and spoke the language of financial liability and legal exposure. He spent 3 days with Eliza's audit materials, and at the end of those 3 days he told her, with the barely contained enthusiasm of a man who has found something he intends to write about in his professional correspondence, that her analysis was the most complete and accurate fraud reconstruction he had seen in 15 years of company law. Walsh was escorted off the property by 2 men Cortland had brought with him, bound for Roseburg, and a legal process that Eliza understood would take months and result in criminal charges. The matter of Aldrich Wells, the original scaler who was presumably somewhere in California by now, was a separate legal problem that was no longer hers. Cortland offered her a contract extension, 3 more months at Camp Harlow at an increased rate, to oversee the clean scale records going forward, and to be available if the legal proceedings required her testimony. She accepted. She accepted partly because the money was right and the work was honest. She accepted partly because of the way Elijah Finley had stood between her and a desperate man on a riverbank on a cold October morning without being asked. She accepted partly because of the tea and the name and the worn copy of Thoreau, but she did not say any of that to Cortland. She said she accepted the terms and signed the paper and shook his hand, and when he left the next morning on the first freight wagon east, she went back to work. That evening she found a book on her desk. It was not her book. She opened the cover and there was no inscription, no note, nothing. But it was a collection of essays by John Muir, published that year, and there was a piece of dried fern tucked between 2 pages near the middle. She sat down at her desk and read the marked pages. They were about old-growth forest, about the particular quality of silence under trees that had stood for 400 years, about the relationship between human scale and natural scale. She closed the book and held it in her hands for a while. Then she took a sheet of paper from her tally book and wrote, "I have thought about what you said about staying somewhere long enough to build something. I think you were right that there is a difference between that and stopping." She folded the paper, wrote his name on it, and gave it to the cook's assistant with instructions to put it on the foreman's desk. She spent the next hour telling herself that she was a practical, self-sufficient woman of 30, who did not behave like a girl of 17, and being almost entirely unable to convince herself that what she felt was anything other than exactly what it was. The weeks that followed were the best and most complicated of Eliza Townsend's life. She worked the loading deck every morning, now with a crew that had largely settled into accepting her authority on questions of scale, because she was invariably right, and they were beginning to understand this. There was something satisfying in the daily precision of it, the way each log had a true measurement that existed independently of anyone's preference, and the way her job was simply to find it accurately. In the afternoons, she was in her office, working on the ongoing scale records, and Elijah often came by in the late afternoon with some question about the day's board footage or the crew contract calculations, and the questions had a way of being answered quickly and then replaced by conversation about other things. He told her, one afternoon in the second week of November, the story he had said he would tell her another time. He had come from Missouri, not Oregon. His father had been a timber man who had moved the family west in 1871, when Elijah was 17, following work and opportunity, and the particular restlessness that had driven so many families in that decade across the wide spaces of the continent. His mother had died in the crossing cholera in Nebraska, which was a death so common in those years as to be almost unremarkable, and was never, for that reason, any less devastating to the people it took and the people it left. His father had found work in the Oregon timber, and Elijah had worked beside him for 4 years and had been good at it. And when his father's hands had been damaged, not destroyed as he had told her earlier, but badly damaged, 2 fingers gone and the grip of the right hand permanently reduced, Elijah had taken over the family's financial responsibility at 21. He had worked every position in the timber operation: choker setter, faller, bull puncher, scaler himself for 2 years, and had moved into camp management because he had a head for the mathematics and the logistics, and because he was, by natural disposition, someone who maintained order more effectively than he experienced chaos. The dark past she had sensed in him was not dramatic in the way of legend. It was not outlawry or violence or hidden crime. It was the specific weight of a young man who had carried too much too young, and had learned to keep his own counsel because there was no one to share the burden with, and had never entirely unlearned it. "You are very self-contained," she said. "It is not a criticism." "I know it is not," he said. "I am working on it." She looked at him. "Are you?" "Apparently," he said, with a brief, dry quality in his voice that she had come to understand was the closest he came to humor in his own direction. "I seem to be giving a woman I have known for 6 weeks the history of my family." "You have known me for 6 weeks," she said. "You have worked beside me for 6 weeks in conditions that show a person more of themselves than most social situations manage in a year. I know more about how you make decisions under pressure than I know about some men I spent 3 years around." He considered this. "That is true, and you know more about me than you probably expect," she said. "You have watched me work. You know I am not careless or imprecise. You know I am not reckless. You know I will tell you the truth when I have one, and I will tell you I do not have one yet when I do not." "I know all of those things," he said quietly. "Then the self-containment is a habit, not a necessity," she said. "Not with me." The room was very quiet. Outside, the November wind moved through the timber with a sound like distant water. "No," he said, "not with you." She did not sleep very well that night, which was entirely his fault and which she considered unfair, given that she had a full day of work in the morning. The following Sunday was the first full day off the camp observed in a month, the company's concession to the approaching winter, which would slow timber operations within a few weeks anyway as the roads became impassable and the river levels rose too high for safe rafting. The men played cards and wrote letters and did the maintenance on their tools that there was never time for during the working week. Elijah asked her, on Saturday evening, if she would walk with him up the ridge trail behind the camp the following morning. She said yes. They left at 7 in the morning, before most of the camp was awake, and they walked up through the timber in the cold, clear air of a November Sunday in the Oregon foothills, on a trail that Elijah clearly knew well. He walked it the way you walk something you have done alone many times and find differently satisfying with company. The trail climbed for a mile and a half through second-growth timber at the base of the ridge, then broke into old-growth Douglas fir that stopped both of them for a moment without any discussion. The trees were enormous 6, 8, 10 feet across at the base, rising 200 feet into the thin morning light, their bark deeply furrowed and rust-red and magnificent. The ground under them was soft with centuries of fallen needles, and the silence was not the silence of absence but the silence of something very large and very old that had no need to announce itself. "This is what you meant," Eliza said quietly. "In the Muir pages." "Yes," Elijah said. They stood together in the old growth for a while and did not speak, and it was not the uncomfortable silence of two people who do not know what to say to each other, but the comfortable silence of two people who are saying something without needing words for it. They sat on a fallen log eventually, and the morning came fully down through the canopy, and they talked for 2 hours about the timber industry and what it was doing to these forests, which both of them had complicated feelings about since it was also how they earned their living, about the Oregon country and where it was going as settlement increased, about what they each wanted for the years ahead. "I have been thinking," she said after a while, "about the scaling business, not just working for camps, running a proper scaling and estimation service independent, not attached to any single company. There are enough operations in this drainage alone to keep 2 scalers busy full-time, and an independent service would be trusted by both the companies and the crews because neither side owns it." He had been looking at the canopy. He looked at her now. "You have worked this out." "I have thought about it for a couple of years. I have not done anything about it because I did not have enough capital to establish it properly. But with this contract and what I saved from the Cockwell operation last year, I am almost there." "Almost," he said, "almost, and I would need to be somewhere with enough operations in range to build the client base. This valley would work. Roseburg would work as a base town." He was quiet for a long time. The wind moved the high canopy above them with a sound like breathing. "Roseburg would work for me as well," he said carefully. "The Pacific lumber contract ends in March." "I have been thinking about the next step." She looked at him. He was not looking at her, looking instead at the enormous tree across the clearing, which was perhaps convenient for both of them as something to look at that was not each other. "Are you telling me something?" she asked. He turned and looked at her then, directly and without the containment he usually wore, and there was something open in his face that she had not seen before, and that cost him something to show. She knew, because she understood by now what it cost a man like him to be open. "I am telling you," he said, "that I think about you when I am not with you, and when I am with you I think about nothing else, and that I have not been able to work out how to say this in a way that doesn't presume too much or ask too little." Eliza Townsend, who was not a woman given to imprecision, sat very still for a moment. Then she said, "You are not presuming too much." He reached over and took her hand where it rested on the fallen log, and held it in his large, warm grip, and they sat together in the old-growth Douglas fir on a November Sunday morning in Oregon, while the light came down through the canopy, and the world was very quiet and very large around them. And she thought that she had been waiting for this particular feeling, not the feeling of falling, but the feeling of arriving for 30 years without quite knowing what she had been waiting for. They walked back to camp holding hands and stopped holding hands when the camp came into view, not out of shame but out of discretion, because they both understood that the men they worked with deserved to find out in the proper way and not by speculation. That evening, Elijah came to her office and stood in the doorway and said, "I intend to speak to you formally about this when we are off the company payroll. I want you to know that." "I know that," she said. "I also want to say, while we are still on the company payroll and I am being careful about the propriety of it, that I have not felt about anyone the way I feel about you, and I am fairly certain this is not a thing that is going to change." She looked at him in the lamplight and the small warm space and thought about a man who had carried too much too young and had spent 4 years building walls and had been undone by a cup of tea. "I know that too," she said. "I feel the same. Now go to bed, Elijah. We have work in the morning." He almost smiled, not quite, but almost, and on his face it was equivalent, and went. December came and brought the rains in earnest. The skid roads became rivers of mud, and the timber operation slowed as Elijah had predicted. The cutting crews moved to maintenance work, repairing the oxen equipment, overhauling the rigging, preparing the camp for the winter months. Eliza's scaling work reduced accordingly, and she spent more of her days on the audit testimony she would need to provide by mail to the Portland legal team handling the Walsh prosecution. They had more time. Not unlimited time. A timber camp in winter was still a working operation, and neither of them was given to idleness, but more evenings that stretched past dark, and more meals shared in the cook tent where the snow came down outside, and the oil lamps made everything warm and orange, and more conversations that had nothing to do with board footage or contract law. He read to her once from the Thoreau. She had not expected that. She had expected to discover that he was a man who read alone and kept it private, which would have been consistent with everything else she knew about him. Instead, he offered, quietly, one evening when the snow was heavy outside and the camp had gone to their bunks early, to read a passage she had mentioned finding interesting when he had lent her the book the previous month. He read well. He read with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, careful, exact, finding the sense of the words rather than just the sound. She sat across the small table from him and listened to his voice and the snow outside and thought about the word, forbidden, which people had used to her on 2 occasions now when they had noticed what was developing between her and Elijah, and she thought it was precisely the wrong word. There was nothing forbidden in it. There was simply 2 people who had chosen, out of professional respect and a shared understanding of the stakes of this particular feeling, to move carefully. The professional period ended on the 1st of January, 1889. Her contract had run through December. She had arranged, through correspondence with a business connection in Roseburg, for a small rented office and 2 preliminary client agreements for independent scaling services in the new year. She had enough capital. She had her plan. She was packing her office on the 31st of December when Elijah came to the door. He had his hat in his hands, which she had never seen before. He was always perfectly composed in his physical presentation, never awkward, never uncertain in his body, and the hat in his hands was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen him do. "I know this is abrupt," he said. "You are going to ask me something," she said. "I am, and I want to say first that I have thought about it carefully, and I want to say second that I understand if the answer is not yes, and I will not pretend not to be affected by that, but I will respect it." "Elijah," she said, "I want to ask you to marry me. I want to ask you specifically so that there is no misunderstanding about what I mean, knowing exactly who you are and what your work means to you and what you intend to build with your business, and without any expectation or assumption that any of that should change. I want to build something beside you, not instead of you." She stood very still. The packed crate was on her desk. The lamp was burning. Outside, the last day of December was turning toward its last hours, and somewhere in the cook tent someone was going to start the New Year celebration that the camp observed with coffee and cornbread and a great deal of noise. "I want to be clear about something," she said. His face did not change. "The answer is yes," she said. "But I want to be clear that I am saying yes because you are the finest man I have ever known, and because I love you, not because it seems logical or practical or because my business plan involves Roseburg. I love you. That is the answer and the only reason for it." He crossed the room and took her face in his hands, and the hat fell somewhere on the floor, and he kissed her in the small, lamplit, partitioned office in a timber camp in the Oregon foothills on the last evening of 1888. And it was the most honest and exact and entirely true thing that Eliza Townsend had ever experienced. They were married in Roseburg on a Saturday in February of 1889, in a small church with a minister who was accustomed to the plain, practical weddings of working people, and who performed the ceremony without unnecessary elaboration. Eliza wore a dark blue wool dress she had ordered from a dressmaker in Roseburg, not a traditional bridal white because it was February in Oregon, and she was a practical woman, and it suited her far better than white would have done. Elijah wore his good coat and his best boots, and looked at her all through the ceremony with the specific attentive quality that was his version of his heart on his face. The witnesses were the cook from Camp Harlow, whose name was Bertram Hoole, and who had been told about the engagement by Elijah 3 weeks before, and had then told everyone else at the camp within approximately 48 hours, and a woman named Clara Draper, who ran the office supply shop in Roseburg, and had helped Eliza establish her business premises, and had become, in the preceding 6 weeks, the closest thing Eliza had to a female friend in the region. After the ceremony, Bertram gave a toast that was mostly about the quality of Eliza's tea, which seemed to confuse Clara and which made Elijah laugh. A real, full laugh that Eliza had not heard from him before, and which she immediately decided was one of her favorite sounds. They rented a house on the edge of Roseburg, a modest 2-story frame structure with enough land behind it for a kitchen garden and a small stable for the 2 horses they would need for the business. Eliza had her office in town, a single rented room above the hardware store on the main street, where she kept her scale books and correspondence, and the increasingly solid roster of client contracts that she was building through February and March. She was right about the business. There were 11 separate timber operations within practical reach of Roseburg, ranging from small family mill operations to company-run camps the size of Camp Harlow, and all of them needed honest, accurate scaling. Within 3 months of opening, Eliza had contracts with 4 of them. Within 6 months, she had 7. By the end of 1889, she had hired a second scaler, a careful young man named Peter Oakes who had learned scaling from his father and understood immediately that working for Eliza Townsend meant doing the work to her standard, which was high, and that this was not a complaint. Elijah left the Pacific Lumber Company in March as he had planned and spent the spring doing exactly what he had said, thinking carefully about what came next. He had spent 20 years in timber operations, and he knew the business from every angle. What he decided, after 3 months of deliberation that Eliza participated in and contributed to substantially, was that he wanted to start a timber survey operation, not logging, but the preliminary work of estimating stand volumes and assessing timber quality, which informed the decisions of the logging companies about where to invest and which operations would yield the most efficiently. It was, she pointed out, a natural complement to her scaling business. Scaling measured timber once it was cut. He would be measuring it before it was cut. Together, they would be able to offer a timber company an accurate picture of a stand from the living tree to the board footage at the mill. We would need to be very careful, she said, about keeping the businesses independent enough to avoid any conflict of interest. Companies should not think they are getting a package deal that compromises the accuracy of either service. Agreed, he said. Separate books, separate contracts, complete independence on every job. But the same office, she said. He looked at her. If it is large enough, I will negotiate with the hardware man for the additional room. She did and won, and they worked 3 feet apart in the expanded above hardware store office space for the next 2 years, and were never accused of compromising their professional independence by anyone who had ever seen Eliza Townsend disagree with Elijah Finley about a board footage estimate. They disagreed occasionally. Not often, and never bitterly, but they were 2 people who had strong professional opinions, and the relationship was robust enough to hold that. She had once, in the autumn of 1889, flatly refused to accept his estimate of the standing timber in a particular drainage north of camp, because her own survey suggested the yield was 15% lower than his figure. They had gone back into the field together, both of them with their instruments and their respective methods, and worked through the stand a second time. Her estimate had been within 3% of the final actual yield. His had been 9% over. He had stood in the field on a cool October morning looking at her figures for a long moment. Then he had said, "You were right." She had understood what it cost a man like him to be wrong about something in his professional area of greatest expertise, and had simply said, "Your method was correct. The stand density was unusually variable because of the fire scar on the northeast slope, which my survey technique picked up and yours did not. It is worth adjusting for on uneven terrain." He had looked at her in the way she recognized now as the look that was deeper and more serious than any compliment, the look of someone encountering something that continued to genuinely surprise them. "How do you always do that?" he said. "Do what?" "Find the piece I missed." "Because I am looking for the piece you missed," she said honestly. "The same way you are looking for the piece I missed. That is what we are for each other." The first time she told him she was expecting a child, it was June of 1890, and she had told him in the office because they were both working when she knew for certain, and she saw no reason to construct a dramatic presentation of a fact when the fact was already quite dramatic enough on its own. He sat very still for a moment after she told him. Then he got up from his desk and came to hers and crouched down beside her chair so he was level with her, and he took both of her hands in his and looked at her for a long time without saying anything, and she watched his face go through several things she had never seen it go through before. "Are you well?" he said finally. "I am very well," she said. "I intend to keep working until I cannot and to go back to work after, and I intend for us to be practical about the arrangements." "Of course," he said quietly, but he was still holding her hands. "Elijah, I am not worried about the arrangements," he said. "I am just—" He stopped. "I know," she said softly. Their son was born in February of 1891, in the house in Roseburg, with a local physician in attendance and Clara Draper there, because Eliza had asked her to be. They named him James, after Eliza's father, and he arrived on a cold February night with the quality of lungs that suggested he intended to be heard, which Elijah said was encouraging. Elijah sat beside her in the bed in the early hours of the morning after James had been fed, and was sleeping in the cradle that Elijah had made himself over the preceding months, sanding the wood smooth in the evenings after she had gone to sleep. In the particular quiet, deliberate way, he did things he cared about. She was exhausted and not inclined to talk much, and he sat beside her in that way he had of being entirely present without needing to fill the space with words. After a while she said, "Are you happy?" He was quiet for a moment. "Happy is not big enough," he said. She closed her eyes. "No," she agreed, "it is not." James Finley grew up in a household where both parents worked and both parents were present, which in the Oregon of the 1890s was less unusual than it might have been elsewhere because frontier life distributed its necessities without much regard for convention. He grew up knowing what board feet were before he could read, and understanding the mathematics of timber estimation by the age of 8 in the way children understand things they have heard discussed at the dinner table all their lives. Eliza went back to work 6 weeks after James was born and managed the business from the office with James in a wooden cradle beside her desk until he was old enough to be watched by the woman 2 houses down who minded several working families' children in the mornings. This arrangement worked, and she refused to feel apologetic about it, and nobody who knew her well had the inclination to suggest she should. The business grew. By 1892, Eliza's scaling operation had expanded to include a third scaler and a small clerical assistant who managed the correspondence, and Elijah's survey work covered territory as far north as the upper Willamette Valley. They had a reputation in the timber industry of southwestern Oregon that was built on the same foundation as Eliza's original reputation: accuracy, honesty, and the particular quality of being uncheatable that came from knowing exactly what you were looking at. There was a moment, in the spring of 1893, when this reputation was tested directly. A large company, the Columbia River Timber Trust, which had been buying up operations across the Pacific Northwest, with the particular aggression of capital that had come west looking for returns, sent a representative to Roseburg with an offer. The offer was for both businesses jointly to be acquired by the trust and operated as its internal scaling and survey department. The numbers they quoted were significant. Eliza and Elijah sat with the representative for an hour in their shared office above the hardware store while he laid out the terms. The representative was polished, well-dressed, and confident in the way of men who were accustomed to being the largest amount of money in the room. After an hour, Eliza said, "Thank you for the presentation. We will need to discuss it." The representative smiled and said he hoped they would see the obvious benefit of the arrangement. After he left, they sat in the office for a long time. Eliza said, "No," Elijah agreed. "The whole value of this business is independence. The moment we work for the trust, we are working for one side of every deal, and every scale record I produce is worthless to anyone trying to do business with the trust because they will assume it is biased." "I know. We are not rich," she said, "but we are building something that is ours and that is worth what it claims to be worth. I will not trade that." He looked at her. "I said no, Eliza. I agreed with you." She looked at him and saw that he was very slightly amused. "You did," she said. "I was talking out loud. I noticed. It is a significant amount of money." "It is," he agreed. "And in 10 years the business will be worth twice what they offered, if we continue on the present path. And more importantly, we will still have built it." She wrote the representative a brief, professional letter of refusal the following morning, thanking him for the offer and declining on the grounds that independence was a material part of their service value. She received back a cool but civil acknowledgement. The Columbia River Timber Trust went on to buy several other operations in the region and to have a complicated legal history over the following decade, some of which involved fraudulent scale records that had been produced by their internal scaling department. Eliza did not comment on this publicly because she was not that kind of person, but she did mention it to Elijah once quietly, and he had looked at her over his coffee in that specific way and said, "You knew." "I suspected," she said precisely. "I did not know." "Same thing," he said, "when it is you doing the suspecting." The second child came in the summer of 1894. A girl, this time, born in July when the heat was considerable and the whole procedure was, Eliza reported to Clara Draper afterward, an exercise in the particular indignity of nature. They named her Margaret for Elijah's mother. She arrived as determined as her brother, with the same quantity of opinion about the state of the world, and from approximately her 3rd year onward she could be found wherever her mother was, watching what Eliza was doing with the focused attention of someone taking notes. James was 12 when Margaret was born, and regarded her with the patient, faintly bewildered affection of an only child confronted with a sibling. He was already working alongside his father in the survey operations on weekends, carrying equipment and learning to read topographic features, and he had his mother's precision with numbers combined with his father's spatial intuition, which Elijah said privately to Eliza was either very promising or very dangerous, and probably both. The Roseburg of 1895 was a different town than the one Eliza had arrived in 6 years earlier, more settled, more connected, with rail service now, and a main street that had expanded twice since she had rented her original office space. The Pacific Northwest was growing fast, and the timber industry was growing with it, and the business that the Finleys had built was solid and respected, and, as Elijah had predicted, worth considerably more than the trust had offered. They expanded the house in 1896, adding a proper study for Eliza where she could work in the evenings, a larger kitchen, and a 3rd bedroom for what she had told Elijah, with the direct informational tone she reserved for business developments and significant personal facts they were going to need in the spring. The 3rd child was a boy they named Thomas, and he arrived in May of 1897, apparently in a hurry, and was from his first days a sunny and cooperative person quite unlike his siblings in temperament, which James considered a personal favor and Margaret considered boring. Elijah, at 43, was a man at the full height of what he had built himself into, not only feared now in the sense of the raw authority of Camp Harlow, but respected in the deeper, more durable way that comes from a decade of showing up and doing good work and being honest about what you knew and did not know. He had a gray now at his temples and a line at the corner of his eyes that Eliza said suited him considerably, and he had developed, in the years with her, something he had not had when they met, an ease, a willingness to be known, that showed up most clearly in the evenings at the supper table with 3 children talking at once, and his wife looking down the table at him with that particular expression she had. She was 39, and she was at the full expression of who she had always been, the business doing exactly what she had envisioned, her name known across the industry as the standard of accuracy in the region, her household organized and warm and intellectually full. She had fought for the business and built it and defended it and would continue to do all 3. And she did all of it as a woman in an industry that still, in 1897, regarded her presence as unusual. And she did not regard this fact with bitterness, but with the clear-eyed pragmatism that had always been her characteristic quality. She regarded the injustice of it, the lower rates she had been paid before she was established enough to negotiate effectively, the time she had needed Elijah's or another man's endorsement to get a contract that her work clearly justified on its own, the occasional representative from a new company who needed to be educated about who he was dealing with before he understood it. She regarded all of this with clear eyes and did not pretend it was not real. It was real, and it was the specific tax levied on capable women in an era that had not yet arranged its institutions to match its working realities, and she intended, where she could, to make it less heavy for the women who came after her by being unambiguously and undeniably excellent at everything she put her hand to. She had, by 1898, trained 2 women scalers, one of whom was working independently in the Cockwell Valley, and one of whom was running the Roseburg operations day-to-day work under Peter Oakes' senior oversight. Both of them had started with her on the deck, learning the scale stick and the rule and the mathematics of board footage, and both of them were now the kind of accurate, honest practitioner that she had spent her life demonstrating was possible. She considered this, quietly, one of the accomplishments she was most proud of. The summer of 1899 was warm and long. The children were 8, 5, and 2, and the house was a place of considerable noise and significant happiness. Elijah had built a proper garden in the back, which had become over the previous winters a project he returned to with the same focused attention he brought to everything, and in the summer evenings they sat on the back porch while the light lasted and watched the children in the garden, and the mountains to the east going gold in the late sun. "I want to tell you something," Elijah said one evening. She was reading, which she could do in conversations because she had a skill for separating the two that he had long since stopped being surprised by. "Tell me," she said, without looking up. "I have been happy," he said. "Every day since you walked into my shack without asking and put tea on my desk, I have been happy. I want to say it plainly." She lowered her book and looked at him. He was looking at the garden, at the children, at the mountains. His face had the open quality she had first seen on a November day in the old growth, when he had taken her hand on a fallen log and the world had been very quiet around them. "I know," she said. "I know you know," he said. "I want to say it anyway." She set down her book and reached over and took his hand where it rested on the arm of his chair, and he turned his palm and held her hand back, and they sat together in the summer evening, with the sounds of the children in the garden and the mountains going gold and the particular quality of satisfaction that comes not from things going perfectly, but from things being deeply, genuinely, truly right. "I was afraid of you," he said after a while. "That first night." She raised an eyebrow. "Afraid of me." "Not in the obvious way, afraid that I was going to feel exactly what I felt and not be able to stop it." "You were not wrong," she said. "No," he agreed. "I was not." "I was not afraid," she said with her characteristic precision. "I was extremely unsettled, which is different." He made the almost smile. "What unsettled you?" "You looked at your thumb," she said, "when I pointed out the burn mark. You looked at it as if you had not been aware of it, and the idea that you had been observed that clearly without being aware of it genuinely surprised you. And I thought, that man is not used to being seen, and I was not expecting to feel what I felt about that." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her. "I was not used to being seen," he said. "I am now." "You are entirely seen," she confirmed, "all the time. By me and by 3 children who watch everything you do." "That is not alarming," he said, "with you." "Good," she said. "It was not intended to be." James came running across the garden with Margaret behind him at a speed that suggested a dispute in progress. And Thomas was sitting in the middle of the vegetable bed, with a look of profound satisfaction that suggested he was responsible for the dispute. And Elijah got up from his chair with the unhurried, deliberate movement that she had first seen on a loading deck in October of 1888, and went to sort out the immediate crisis. And Eliza watched him go with her book in her lap, and the mountains going pink behind the house, and thought that a person could spend a whole life looking for the right kind of home, and find it, in the end, not in a place but in another person. She had found it in a man who stood between her and a desperate man on a riverbank without being asked, who left books on her desk with dried fern between the pages, who read Thoreau to her in a lamplit shack while snow fell on the Oregon foothills, who looked at her all through their wedding ceremony with his heart plainly on his face, who said, "You were right," on a cold October morning in a stand of Douglas fir, and meant it without reservation, who had been undone by a cup of tea. She picked up her book and went back to reading in the evening light, listening to the sounds of her household around her, the children, the garden, Elijah's voice sorting through the justice of whatever dispute had erupted, and felt, from the ground up, the specific and irreducible quality of a life that was entirely and precisely her own. In the years that followed, the business continued to grow and to be the thing they had built it to be. James grew up and came into the survey work with his father, as everyone who had watched him had expected, and eventually took over its management with the same combination of precision and spatial intelligence that had made Elijah's reputation for 20 years. Margaret grew up and did something none of them had quite predicted, which was to go to the University of Oregon in 1910 and study law, which she said she intended to practice in Roseburg, and which she did, and whose particular specialty turned out to be contract disputes in the timber industry, which was either irony or simply the inevitable expression of having grown up in a household where contract law was a regular topic at the dinner table. Thomas, who was the most sociable of the 3, became a timber broker, the man between the sellers and the buyers, and was extremely good at it in the way that genuinely warm and perceptive people are good at any work that involves understanding what other people actually want. Eliza and Elijah were in their late 50s when the 3 children were fully launched into their own lives, and they had more evenings on the back porch again, and more mornings to walk into the foothills when the work permitted, and the mountains to the east went gold in the summer evenings and white in the winter mornings, and the old-growth Douglas fir still stood in the ridges above the valley. The trees that had been there when they walked among them in November of 1888 and held hands for the first time on a fallen log. They went back to that stand once, in the autumn of 1909. It was October, 21 years to the month, and the trees were as they had always been, enormous, unhurried, entirely indifferent to the passage of time in the way of things that measure time differently. They stood in the same quiet that they had stood in the first time, and it was still not the quiet of absence but the quiet of something large and old that had no need to announce itself. "It is exactly the same," Eliza said. "Yes," Elijah said. "We are not," she said. "No," he agreed. He was looking at her in the way he had always looked at her, attentive and careful and entirely present. 21 years had changed the surface of things. The gray at his temples had spread. She had lines at her eyes and mouth that she regarded as fair evidence of a life well lived, but not the quality of his attention, not the specific way he looked at her that had, every single time she encountered it, made her feel precisely and completely seen. "I love you," she said, in the old growth on a cold October morning, because she said it often and meant it every time and saw no reason not to say it now. "I love you," he said, and it was the voice that had introduced her to 40 men in a meal tent and stood between her and a desperate man on a riverbank and said her name for the first time in a lamplit shack, and it was entirely and simply true. She took his hand the way she had the first time, sitting on the fallen log in the same November cold air, and the forest held them in its old quiet, and the mountains were there beyond the canopy, and everything was exactly as it should be. They walked back down the trail together, through the old growth and the second growth timber and the mud and the morning, home to Roseburg, to the house and the garden and the expanded office above the hardware store, and the decades of work and argument and precision and respect and love that had made them, in the end, what they were: two people who had found in each other something that was worth the entire length of a life. The most feared man at the timber camp had been undone by a cup of tea. And she had known, even then, standing in that lamplight with her arms folded and her chin up, that it was the beginning of the most important thing that had ever happened to either of them. She had simply been too honest not to act on it, and he had been too honest not to let her.